The last brass had stopped tinkling into the buckets an hour ago, and the range had that after-hours hush that wasn't quiet so much as emptied out, like a stadium after the lights go cold. Heat still lived in the gravel. The berms held the day's noise in their packed dirt the way old walls hold smoke. A few paper silhouettes hung slack on their frames, chewing at the breeze. Somewhere behind the tower, a generator clicked and settled, and the only steady sound was the faint scrape of a broom on concrete where no one bothered looking. A convoy rolled slow along the service road like it owned the place the way only people who did this for a living ever believed they did. Two vehicles, dust-colored, squared off, armored enough to make them feel safe, and a small support buggy with tool cases lashed down, a box of spent magazines, a cooler, the leftovers of a training day that had run long. Nobody was laughing, but there was that looseness in their posture that came when the formal block was over and the danger was supposed to be put away with the targets. They entered the choke point without thinking of it as one. The berm rose hard on their left, a blunt wall of dirt and old lead. On the right, the ground climbed into scrubby slope, sun-bleached brush, rock shelves, ragged pockets of shadow. The road narrowed with a maintenance access cut through, and beyond it a chain-link gate separated the range edge from the outer lanes, a thin fence that existed more for rules than for stopping anyone with intent. The first crack didn't sound like training. It didn't echo the same. It was a clean, distant snap that punched the air and came back wrong, as if the hills had decided to speak in a different language. Then the ridgeline beyond the berms lit up with live fire. Dust jumped off the berm in sharp puffs, not random, not spray, measured bites, walking in a line that tracked the convoy's movement. The front vehicle lurched to a stop as the driver reacted on instinct, and the moment it halted, the geometry became obvious. Berm left, scrub slope right. No clean cover, no exit except forward into the teeth or reverse into the same corridor. The buggy swerved behind the second vehicle, and all of them piled out into that narrow strip of cover that felt like cover only if you'd never met someone who could shoot through the gaps. Radios burst to life, one sharp voice, a clip call sign, then a wash of digital garbage. A squawk, a half-syllable, silence. A second attempt, louder, angry, and again the same. A hard spike, then dead air as if the frequencies themselves had been cut with wire cutters. Hand signals took over, quick and hard, palms flat, fingers stabbing direction. The cadre moved like their bodies had memorized the grammar. Two men peeled to the rear wheel well, another to the front. One dropped prone behind a shallow dip in the road where rainwater sometimes pooled. Rounds cracked overhead and slapped dirt. The berm's face sprayed grit. A burst chopped the brush on the slope, turning leaves into confetti. A designated marksman, taller, leaner, the one who'd been scanning without looking like he was scanning, lifted his optic to the ridgeline and took a hit before he could finish a breath. It wasn't a dramatic fall. It was a sudden collapse of structure, a shoulder jerk and knee buckling, his rifle dropping into the dust. He tried to sit up and couldn't. Blood spread fast in the wrong place, dark through tan fabric. Sniper, someone mouthed, no sound needed because everyone saw the difference now. This wasn't harassing fire. This wasn't a bored kid shooting at noise. This was someone who could choose exactly when to pull the trigger and what that pull would change. The range safety system, lights on the tower, the warning strobes that were supposed to scream if anything went wrong, flickered once, twice, then went dark. A moment later, one strobe tried to come back, a weak blink like a dying heartbeat, and then it failed again. The tower speaker popped with static and then cut out. It wasn't just an attack on people. Someone was reaching into the site itself, flipping switches that shouldn't have been reachable. At the far edge of the range, behind the chain-link gate, the maintenance worker had been sweeping, alone in a rectangle of shadow cast by the berm. She had a broom in her hand and a small trash bin by her boot, and she froze with the bristles pressed to concrete like she'd been caught mid-thought. She was in plain view if anyone bothered to look, but everyone's eyes were pulled by muzzle flashes and dust impacts and the immediate math of survival. "Get down," one of the cadre shouted anyway. More reflex than strategy. "Stay out of the way." She obeyed halfway, knees bending, body angling toward the fence, but she didn't run. Running meant exposing yourself in open space. Running meant becoming a moving target for a shooter who was already proving he could pick out a shoulder. The wounded marksman dragged himself, not toward his team, but toward the fence line as if something in his brain had made a decision his mouth hadn't explained. He crawled on his elbows, legs dead weight, leaving a smear in the dust. Rounds snapped above him. One struck the service road marker behind, spitting plastic. A burst chewed the berm's lip. He kept moving. When he reached the fence, he didn't stop. He jammed his rifle forward through a narrow gap where the chain link sagged, an old repair someone had never finished. The barrel scraped metal. His hands were shaking, but the movement was deliberate, a confession made physical. The maintenance worker stared at the rifle like it was a live thing. His fingers found her wrist, clamped hard. His eyes weren't pleading. They were urgent in a way that felt colder than fear. He tried to speak, and the first attempt was only breath. The second was broken words, essentials thrown out like life rafts. "Breathe," he rasped. A cough dragged blood to his lip. "Don't chase." Another cough. "Find a radio guy." She didn't understand all of it yet, but her body did something older than understanding. Her left hand slid to the rifle's handguard. Her right found the grip. Not clumsy, not curious. Familiar. "Ma'am, no." Someone barked from the road, seeing it too late and seeing only the category they'd assigned her. "Get down." "That's not. Stay out of the way." The assumption hit her harder than the rounds hit the berm. Not because it was insulting, because it was normal, because it was the world's easiest mistake to make. A second burst pinned the seals tighter. The front vehicle's engine coughed once, twice, then died, whether from a round through something vital or the sudden failure of electronics in a place where they shouldn't fail, it didn't matter. The vehicle that had been covered turned into a trap, a dead mass you couldn't move, a magnet for anyone trying to finish what they started. From behind the fence, the maintenance worker's angle was different. She wasn't looking where the cadre was looking because she wasn't trained to read their hand signals. She wasn't watching the ridgeline for Flash because Flash was everywhere now, stuttering in and out of scrub shadow. Her eyes went to the rock shelf halfway up the slope where the brush broke around a pale scar of stone. Something there moved with intent. Two shapes, one lower, one higher, the higher pausing whenever the lower shifted like a practice dance. Her chest tightened. The broom lay forgotten on the concrete. The rifle felt heavier than it should. And then, because her hands knew where to put weight and where not to, its balance came into place. Somewhere in the chaos, a shot came from a direction that didn't make sense. Not from the convoy, not from the berm, not even from the ridgeline beyond. A single, precise crack. One of the attackers on the slope, a figure who'd been relaying with quick gestures, folded as if a string had been cut, dropped behind a rock shelf, and didn't rise again. The SEALs felt the change before they understood it. A half second of slack in the pattern. A hitch in the enemy's rhythm. They lifted their heads, searching for the shooter who had helped them, and found nothing. No muzzle flash. No exposed silhouette. Just a fence, a shadowed edge, and a civilian who should not have been holding a rifle. Except she was. Earlier that morning the range had been ordinary in the most specific, unromantic ways. The air smelled like oil and sun-baked paper. The brass in the outer lanes glittered like cheap coins. The maintenance worker moved through it with a push broom and a magnet roller, collecting the little pieces of other people's work. Her name badge was the kind contractors wore, generic, laminated, a company logo that meant nothing. It was easy for people to look at the badge and decide they already knew the whole story. She kept her posture careful, not timid, controlled, like someone who understood that being noticed had consequences. The tower operators talked past her. The instructors walked around her as if she were a cone. When people spoke near her, it was about her, not to her range maintenance contractor. She'll get that, like she was part of the infrastructure. The range itself had anchor points that never changed. Bermed lanes cut into the earth like scars, a tower that watched everything and nothing. The service road, running like a vein along the perimeter, scrub hills rising beyond the far berms where the land turned from managed to wild. Farther back, half hidden by fencing and warning signs, sat a restricted annex building. Newer, cleaner, the kind of place that made even confident men lower their voices when they mentioned it. It had cameras and keypads, and a sense of being slightly out of place among the dust and the old targets. The cadre arrived mid-morning for a closed block. Vehicles rolled in, and the body language changed with them. Their presence tightened the space. The maintenance worker kept sweeping. She didn't stop when the first reports began. She didn't flinch when steel targets rang like bells. She shifted her broom to avoid the line of fire without needing to be told. That, in itself, was a kind of invisible competence, moving as if she understood arcs and danger cones, as if she'd spent time in places where you learn those things fast. A wind flag line had been left tangled near the outer lane, a strip of cloth twisted around its cord, useless for reading the breeze. One of the younger range hands had walked past it twice and never noticed. The maintenance worker stopped, crouched, and untangled it with quick fingers, then retied it so it hung clean. She tested it with a small pull, watched how it settled. She didn't do it to be praised. She did it because a tangled flag meant someone later might misread the wind and blame their miss on themselves instead of the environment. At one point, a target frame had come loose, the wood flexing. Reports cracked nearby. The paper silhouette fluttered. She stepped in without hesitation, stabilized the frame, tightened the fastener with a tool from her pouch, and stepped back out before anyone could tell her not to. Loud noise didn't seem to startle her. It registered, but it didn't control her. Inside that tool pouch, folded behind a roll of tape and a small wrench, was a worn cloth patch. The stitching had faded. The emblem was one only certain communities recognized. She kept it tucked away like contraband. When footsteps approached behind her, she slid the pouch closed and shifted her body to block the view without looking like she was blocking anything. She heard conversations that weren't meant for her and learned to hold her face neutral. Words floated over her head as if she were a piece of furniture. A new sensor package being installed in the restricted annex. A VIP evaluation later in the week. A tight security brief. The kind of talk that made the air feel more expensive. Her reason for being there was simple on paper. Contractor work. A steady check. A life detour that had dropped her into ordinary labor after years she didn't discuss. She didn't seek attention. She didn't correct people when they spoke down to her. She took the invisibility as a shield, even when it felt like a weight. But she noticed things. An unmarked maintenance truck had been inside the perimeter earlier than scheduled, rolling slow as if it belonged. Its driver wore the right kind of vest, but didn't look up at the tower the way people who worked there always did. One camera on a pole near the service road was missing. Where there should have been a black bubble, there was only a bracket and a cut cable tucked too neatly to be an accident. A gate that was supposed to squeal, a gate everyone cursed because it screamed like a dying hinge, had opened that morning without sound, smooth as if it had been oiled or swapped. She stood there, broom in hand, and debated reporting it. She pictured the response. Polite nods, eyes already moving away, the assumption that she was overreacting. She learned what dismissal felt like. Silence became self-protection. She made a note in her head instead, the way you do when you can't trust anyone else to care. Then the ambush snapped the day in half, and the note became a warning that was suddenly late. In the present, the wounded marksman's hand had clamped her wrist like an order. His eyes, dulled by pain, still held a professional calculation. He had seen something in her earlier, maybe the way she handled noise, maybe the way she moved through danger without flailing, maybe the way her shoulders settled when she lifted weight. Whatever it was, he chose her in his last working moments. She took the rifle and checked it the way someone checks a tool they know intimately. A fast glance at the magazine, a tactile count of what was left, a chamber check without theatrics. The optic's brightness flickered, dimmed, threatened to die. Battery near gone. She winced, not at the idea of shooting, but at the idea of doing it with failing gear. She lowered her body behind the fence line, using the shadow cast by the berm and the fence posts to break her outline. She wasn't trying to be brave. She was trying to be useful. That distinction mattered to her more than anyone else could understand in the moment. Under the gunfire, she heard something else. A faint drone hum far out, a mosquito whine that didn't belong to any of the range's normal equipment. It was subtle, It was almost easy to dismiss. But she didn't dismiss it. She filed it with the missing camera, the smooth gate, the unmarked truck. The pattern was forming whether she wanted it to or not. On the service road, the cadre tried to break the kill zone the way doctrine demanded. One driver attempted to shift the second vehicle forward to create a moving barrier. The enemy fire walked with them as if the shooter was reading their mind, snapping into the spaces they were about to occupy. Someone on the slope wasn't guessing. Someone was observing, adjusting, correcting, disciplined. Comms remained dead. A satellite backup attempt failed too. One of the cadre lifted a handset, turned slightly to shield it, and the expression on his face tightened as the device spat out nothing but failure. Heavy jamming, or worse, a localized repeater spoofing the band, feeding silence where calls should be. Either way, it meant they were alone in a place that should never have allowed aloneness. Dust and smoke thickened from impacts along the berm. The air became a brown haze. Visibility collapsed. Sight lines that mattered became guesses. The berm, which should have been cover, became a source of choking grit as rounds struck and threw dirt into mouths and eyes. A medic moved to the first wounded, hands working fast, and took a grazing hit, just enough to draw blood and force a flinch that cost time. Bleeding control became a time sink. Every second spent wrapping and pressing was a second not spent moving, shooting, thinking. Then the enemy introduced a new threat. An RPG team, 2 figures lower on the slope, shifted position, the tube's outline briefly visible against sky. The cadre saw it and felt the trap tighten. An RPG didn't need to hit perfectly. It just needed to hit close enough to turn the disabled vehicle into a coffin. The range gate, main retreat route at the far end, locked unexpectedly. A click, a flicker on the control panel, and the heavy mechanism refused to respond. The electronic system was either failing at the worst possible moment or being deliberately overridden. The idea that someone could reach into the range infrastructure while rounds flew made the hair on the back of the maintenance worker's neck rise. The attackers weren't just trying to kill. They were shaping movement. Each time a SEAL tried to angle left, a burst suppressed that path. Each time someone looked right, a single shot snapped too close, a warning that the ridge had eyes. The net was closing, herding the cadre toward a corridor that led, inevitably, toward the restricted annex area. From her angle behind the fence, she tracked the pattern. The dead zone of comms had boundaries. Jamming wasn't magic. It had a source, a position that made sense if you understood line of sight and terrain. She looked at the service road markers, the fence posts, the distance to the rock shelf, and estimated where a jammer would need to sit to anchor that consistent blackout. Ammo burned fast under suppression. The cadre's magazines emptied in steady cycles. Fire to keep heads down, reload behind thin cover, fire again. They couldn't win a sustained volume fight if the enemy had chosen this ground and brought a plan. The marksman at the fence shuddered as pain stole more of him, his breathing turning wet. His rifle, now in her hands, was both tool and burden. The drone finally appeared as a small dark speck above the scrub, almost invisible until it moved wrong. Too smooth, too deliberate. It paused, hovered, then drifted toward her fence-line position as if drawn by a thread. Her stomach dropped. The enemy wasn't only hunting the cadre anymore. They were counter-hunting whoever had fired that impossible angle shot. Meaning her. Meaning the shadow behind the fence that didn't fit their map of the battlefield. She had a choice that tasted like metal in her mouth. Stay hidden at the fence and keep shaping the fight from a constrained angle, knowing the drone would eventually mark her. Or move, alone, to a better position, risking exposure, betting that the knowledge she'd built by being invisible on this range could become a weapon. She made the decision without drama. The kind of decision people later call brave, but in the moment felt like simple arithmetic. If she stayed, they would find her. If she moved, she might stay alive long enough to matter. She stripped down to essentials. Rifle, 2 spare magazines scavenged from the fading marksman's kit. A small tool pouch she'd carried all day, the one people assumed held only wrenches and tape. A radio she knew wouldn't work yet, but took anyway because the moment it did, It would be everything. The optic brightness died fully as she adjusted it. The reticle remained, etched, faint, reliable, but the crisp, illuminated that made fast shots easier was gone. She exhaled slowly and accepted it. Fundamentals didn't need batteries. She watched the enemy's fire rhythm. Even disciplined shooters had cadence. Bursts, pauses, shifts as spotters relayed. She timed her movement to those loud bursts, so her footsteps vanished inside the violence. When the ridge cracked with rapid fire, she moved. When it paused, she became still. Near the base of the berm was a maintenance access crawl space, covered by a panel most people ignored because they didn't know it existed. It was used for cables, for drainage, for the unglamorous guts of the range. She knew it because she had cleaned around it, because she had once retrieved a lost wrench from its edge, because invisibility makes you learn the routes no one else respects. She slid the panel open with careful fingers and slipped inside, dragging the rifle after her. The space smelled of damp dirt and old concrete. It was tight enough to force her shoulders inward. She moved on elbows and knees, dirt grinding into her sleeves, breath loud in her own head. Above, round snapped. The drone's hum grew closer, then faded as it swept her last position and lingered. The enemy confirmed someone else was in play. Their urgency sharpened. She could feel it even without seeing it, like pressure changing in a room. She emerged behind the lanes into scrubland no one bothered with, a strip of unmanaged ground between the range's clean geometry and the hill's messy truth. The wind had picked up. Dust rode it in little waves. Her hands shook for one heartbeat, then stilled as she forced herself back into the simplest rules. Inhale, exhale, pause. Breathe. A rocky cut offered a narrow perch, a slice of elevation that overlooked both the service road and the approach to the annex corridor. It wasn't a heroic sniper nest. It was an awkward, half-hidden shelf that a person only found if they'd spent time walking the edges of the place with a broom and a trash bin, if they'd once chased wind-blown paper targets into the brush and cursed the thorns. From that perch, she saw the enemy's organization clearly for the first time. This wasn't a random group firing from wherever. There was a spotter with binoculars low behind a rock, head moving in controlled arcs. Near him sat a bag with a protruding antenna, too purposeful to be anything but a jammer. Farther down, an RPG team repositioned, moving with rehearsed hand signals. A squad leader used controlled gestures, directing, shaping, keeping everyone in sync. And higher on the ridge, where the light cut hard, a sniper/spotter pair held the overwatch that controlled the kill zone. She also saw something that made her throat tighten, a civilian contractor vehicle near the annex, parked too close to the corridor. Collateral risk. People who didn't know they were inside a raid. She couldn't just shoot at anything that moved. She had to choose targets with discipline or become the danger she was trying to stop. Her mind built a ladder without words. Stop the jamming. Stop the heavy weapons. Break the leader. Collapse the overwatch. Anything else was noise. She steadied the rifle against the rock, felt the stock settle into her shoulder. The reticle sat faint against the world. Wind tugged at her hair. Dust crawled across her tongue. She waited for a clean background behind the jammer Operado. Nothing behind him but dirt and scrub. No vehicle. No fence. No friendly silhouette. When the operator leaned forward to adjust something on the pack, she fired. The shot was suppressed enough by distance and terrain that it didn't announce itself to everyone at once. But the effect was immediate. The jammer operator snapped backward, collapsed in a way that didn't look theatrical, and the antenna dipped into the dust. A heartbeat later, faint radio static returned, thin, broken, like a voice waking from anesthesia. Down on the service road, one of the cadre tried to call. It came out cracked, distorted, but it existed. The spell was cracking. She didn't celebrate. She shifted the reticle to the machine gun position. The crew-served weapon had been pinning the service road, its muzzle flashes stitching fear into the dust. The assistant leaned in to feed, to guide, to keep it running. She waited for the smallest clear window and took him out with one shot. The gun faltered. The gunner hesitated, just 3 seconds, A micro pause where the weapon lost its rhythm. 3 seconds was an eternity for trained people. The cadre exploited it without needing to know why it happened. They dragged the wounded behind the disabled vehicle, gained a better angle on the berm, repositioned with the kind of speed that only comes from being told your whole life that moments like this are why you train. The enemy adapted fast. They didn't panic. They reacted like professionals. The drone, which had been sweeping wide, turned and launched directly toward her perch, closing distance as if it had been given her coordinates. Climbers began moving along the ridge spine in a two-prong approach. One high, one low, classic counter-sniper pincer. Someone had decided the unseen shooter was now the problem that needed solving. She relocated inches at a time, not trusting any spot once she fired. She slid to a secondary pocket in the rock, used a scrap of netting from her tool pouch, something she'd once used to cover equipment from dust, to break her silhouette. She fired once and moved, refusing the impulse to peek twice from the same angle. That impulse killed people. She found the squad leader when he exposed himself to signal a flank. His hand rose, fingers cutting the air. She put the reticle on the center mass she could see and took the shot. He dropped. The immediate change in enemy movement was visible even from her distance. Hesitation, misalignment, small clusters moving without the same cohesion. Leadership broken didn't end a fight, but it changed its shape. Then the enemy sniper finally revealed himself. Not with a flash, but with a near miss. Rock beside her cheek cracked, a sharp splinter snapping off and slicing skin. She tasted blood, hot and metallic, and for half a second fear surged so hard her vision narrowed. She forced it back down. Function, breath, fundamentals. The duel wasn't romantic. It was a cold exchange of geometry and patience. She couldn't see him clearly, but she could read the ridge. A micro shadow on the lip, a dust kick from a shot, the way brush moved when a body settled behind it. She needed him to shoot again, but she couldn't offer her face. So she exposed something else. A small glint, metal from her tool pouch, angled into the light from a false position, just enough to look like an optic catching sun. She held her breath. The sniper took the bait. A shot cracked. Dust jumped off a rock edge 2 feet from a glint. That dust kick was a signature, a direction, a starting point. She traced the line back, found the tiny shift in shadow, the micro movement that gave away a man trying not to be a man. Her optic was dim. The reticle was faint. The wind was rude. She trusted fundamentals anyway. She fired. The ridge went still in a way that had nothing to do with hiding. The spotter near him jerked, scrambled, tried to pull the body back, and in that movement exposed himself. She fired again, faster this time, and the spotter crumpled behind the ridge lip. On the ground, the cadre moved. Without the overwatch snapping at every attempt, they pushed to a better berm, pulled wounded into a tighter casualty bundle, and began shifting toward the route that was now partially open. Their hand signals became more confident. Their movement had direction instead of desperation. But the raid wasn't only about killing them. Near the annex corridor, a small team moved with purpose toward the annex door, carrying a hard case. Dark, reinforced, the kind of thing you use for something delicate and expensive. They weren't advancing on the seals. They were advancing on the objective. The maintenance workers' stomach clenched. The conversations she'd overheard that morning snapped into focus. The new sensor package, the evaluation, the security talk. Exports sensitive, high value, something worth turning a secure range into a battlefield. One attacker reached the hard case. Another watched the corridor. The contractor vehicle sat too close, innocent and stupid. She couldn't risk a shot that might punch through and hit someone who wasn't part of this. She chose a disabling shot, not because she was merciful, but because she was disciplined. She aimed for the leg/hip line, where structure failed without guaranteeing death, waited for a clean moment, and fired. The case carrier dropped hard, a sudden collapse that spilled the hard case into the open. It bounced once, skidded, and came to rest half in shadow. The attacker grabbed at his leg, face twisting, fight draining out of him. The enemy escalated with volume fire and smoke near the annex, trying to cover the retrieval. The drone hovered closer now, searching for muzzle flash, hanging in the air like an accusation. It was close enough that she could hear its whine as a physical thing, a needle pressing into her skull. She waited until it paused, until the drone steadied itself to look. The moment it stopped moving, it became predictable. Predictable was shootable. She clipped it with one controlled shot. The drone pitched, spun, and spiraled down into the scrub, its hum warping into a dying scream before it crashed out of sight. The enemy lost their eyes, their easy answer to the unseen shooter. With leadership broken, jammer down, Overwatch neutralized, and the hard case dropped exposed, the enemy began a disciplined withdrawal. Still dangerous, still capable, but no longer in control. They didn't run in panic. They peeled back in coordinated bounds, covering each other, trying to salvage what they could of the raid without being trapped themselves. Extraction arrived tight to the window, not with cinematic thunder, but with efficient urgency. Vehicles moved into position. Casualty load happened fast. Hands lifting, straps tightening, voices clipped. There were no victory poses, no shouting, just relief that tasted like exhaustion. The cadre left the service road the way people leave a place they never wanted to be memorable. The hard case was recovered near the annex, technicians swarming it like bees. Under controlled conditions, they confirmed what it held. Components from a new sensor and targeting system being evaluated, high value and sensitive enough that losing it would have been more than embarrassment. It would have been a breach that rippled outward into other places, other lives. The security review that followed didn't treat the ambush as a random attack. The evidence was too clean. The missing camera, the smooth gate, the unmarked truck, those weren't coincidences. They traced back through subcontractor routes, access logs, vendor schedules. It wasn't full insider leadership, not someone with deep authority running the show from within. It was facilitation, compromised access, a thread pulled just enough to let the right people in at the right time. The motive clarified with that same cold logic, a deliberate raid, disguised as an ambush. Steal the sensor package. If possible, capture footage of hitting elite operators for propaganda, proof of concept for whoever funded it. The kill zone wasn't just a killing field. It was a curtain, meant to keep eyes and bodies pinned while the theft happened behind. In a quiet room away from the range, the cadre commander asked the question everyone had avoided because saying it out loud made it real. Who took those shots? The operators exchanged looks. They'd felt the help. They'd moved because the pattern changed. They'd heard comms crack back into existence. But none of them had seen a friendly shooter in a friendly position. None of them had heard a call sign. The unknown had shaped the fight from silence. Someone mentioned the fence. Someone mentioned the maintenance worker, the civilian they'd told to get down and stay out of the way. The assumption felt ugly in hindsight. She was brought in without ceremony. No stage, no assembled crowd, just a chair, a table, and faces that were trying to decide what they owed her while also trying to decide what she was. Her name on the badge was still generic. Her hands were still dirty with grit under the nails. There was a thin cut on her cheek from splintered rock and a bruise blooming on her shoulder where the rifle stock had lived. They asked questions that weren't accusations but weren't gentle either. What did she learn to shoot? Why was she here? Why didn't she report the missing camera, the smooth gate, the unmarked truck? She answered with the kind of honesty that didn't beg for sympathy. Former military marksmanship instructor, adjacent support role, not a headline, but enough training to build discipline into muscle. She'd left after a personal loss that made loud places feel like wounds. She didn't want attention. She didn't want to be pulled back into a life she'd worked hard to step away from. Contractor work had been a way to rebuild stability without being seen. Her silence about the anomalies wasn't malice. It was a flaw, self-protection hardened into habit. She'd learned that speaking up got you labeled difficult, dramatic, disposable. She'd chosen to note and watch instead of report, and the choice had almost cost people everything. They told her, then, about the marksman who'd died, how he'd crawled to the fence, how he'd forced his rifle into her hands. They explained that his last act hadn't been luck. He'd noticed her earlier. The way she handled noise. The way she adjusted equipment. The way she moved around danger like she respected it instead of fearing it. He'd recognized fundamentals in her posture and bet on it the way professionals sometimes do when there are no clean options left. The room went quiet. Not the dismissive quiet she'd lived under for months. A different quiet. Chosen. Waited. Respect didn't come as speeches. It came in small, exact ways. A patch. One of theirs, placed on the table without flourish. A senior operator giving a simple nod that acknowledged her without turning her into a mascot. A clipped, "You did good," said like a fact, not a compliment. Loose ends were tied with the same disciplined efficiency that had saved lives on the road. The drone operator was identified. The raid team's withdrawal route was tracked and handed off to people whose job it was to hunt after the smoke cleared. The sensor package was secured, logged, and used to tighten base security going forward. No victory lap, just prevention of a bigger breach. Later, after the reports and the questions and the long stretch of adrenaline's aftermath had drained into a hollow tiredness, she stood back at the range edge with a broom in her hand again. The concrete was scuffed where rounds had struck dirt and where boots had scraped in the scramble. A few brass casings glinted in the late light, stubborn as ever. She swept them into a neat line, the bristles whispering across the ground. The silence around her wasn't dismissal now. It wasn't people talking past her, as if she were infrastructure. It was her own calm, chosen after surviving violence she hadn't asked for and answering it anyway. Somewhere out beyond the berms, the hills sat indifferent, holding their shadows. The range safety lights had been repaired. The gate squealed again, obnoxious as ever. A camera pole wore a new black bubble, its presence obvious now only because she'd once noticed its absence. She kept sweeping, steady, and unhurried, and for the first time in a long time, being quiet didn't feel like disappearing. It felt like control.